We are back with a new Shapes.io video. I am Binz, and in part 7 of the BUTTMAM series, we are going to be talking about ticks. What are ticks? Well, according to Wikipedia, they are parasitic arachnids that are approximately 3 to 5 millimeters in length and who live by feeding on the blood of mammals, birds, and sometimes reptiles and amphibians. Now, since that was probably the saddest attempt at a funny icebreaker intro you've ever heard, please leave this video an encouraging like. In the context of this game, a tick is obviously something else. More specifically, it is the unit of time that Shapes.io uses. Someone may correct me on this, but as far as I'm aware, a tick is practically synonymous with a frame, in the sense that if you have a constant frame rate of, let's say, 60 FPS, then I believe Shapes.io processes 60 ticks per second as well. I am not 100% sure, but it doesn't really matter for today's purposes. Either way, the concept of ticks applies exclusively to the wiring and logic layer, and I must say that I never paid any attention to it prior to attempting to build a TMAM. As long as your wiring and logic modules remain relatively simple, you need not concern yourself with what ticks are. And by simple in this sense, I specifically mean one-way modules that take an input, process it, provide an output, and done. When you play the game and you unlock the wiring, logic gates, and virtual processing units, then for all practical purposes, those modules have an instantaneous function, right? When you feed a signal into a unit, it outputs the processed value immediately. This is unlike the physical units, the stacker and the painters and the cutters and the rotators and so on, who have a capped processing ability of being able to handle only a certain amount of units per second, which is something for which you're likely going to spend quite some time frantically amassing your upgrade shapes in order to raise that ceiling. That's the wrong one. The upgrade shapes. Yeah, so these. You're going to amass these in order to up your cap limits, but virtual processing units don't have that problem. Or, at least that's what it seems like in the beginning. You can compare it to light speed. The speed of light seems instantaneous, right? When you turn on a light bulb or you light a candle in a dark room, then the room is lit instantaneously. But as we hopefully all learned in school, the speed of light is not infinite. It's just that it's so incredibly fast that for all practical day-to-day purposes, it seems infinitely fast. However, the bigger your scale gets, the slower the supposed infinitely fast speed of light becomes in comparison. For instance, it takes sunlight over 8 minutes to reach the Earth, and it takes the light of the nearest star from our own sun over 4 years to reach the Earth. So the bigger your scope, the slower light seems to become. So I hope you kind of already know where I'm going with this. When it comes to the virtual layer in this game, then the wires, gates, and processing units appear infinitely fast, but only at first. And that's because at first, just like with light speed, you're working on a very small scale. And just like with light speed, the bigger the scale you're working on, the more noticeable it becomes that your processing units actually have a tiny delay. And that delay is a tick. Each virtual unit, whether it be an OR gate or any other gate, a virtual unstacker or cutter or rotator, you name it, each one of them requires one tick to process its input and provide an output. And therefore, since Shapes.io is incredibly scalable, the bigger you build your modules, the more of those ticks will accumulate. Eventually, you'll reach a point where the processing delay of your virtual modules becomes measurable in seconds. In other words, the bigger you make your wiring modules, the slower they become. So first, let me set up a practical example to show what I mean. We're going to find an empty spot, and we're going to go to the wiring layer, and I'm going to set up a constant signal here, let's say of the blueprint shape, right? And I'm going to split this wire in two. Let's see, transistor to block feedback. So the signal on the wire itself is instantly. You can make this wire, theoretically infinitely long, I guess, and the signal will be carried on immediately. However, if we place let's say a rotator, right, then this signal will have a 1 tick delay between being input here and being output on the right. And if you chain that up to the extreme, then you will see that the processing delay actually becomes very noticeable. So instead of having one rotator, let's rotate it 4 times so we get the same shape again. Okay, so that's 4, 8, 12, 16. Let's say 20, okay? And now we're going to copy that, turn it around. So that's 40. That is 80, 120, 160, 200. Okay, so let me quickly join this up. All right, there we go. So I prepared a little chain, and I have two displays right here, so we can see the difference, right? The bottom line is, if I counted correctly, I have 200 rotators here, and that will mean we will get a 200 tick delay between this signal, which is carried out instantly, and the other signal connected to the bottom display. So let's see this work in action. If I press the button, then you see this shape, travel through all of the units, and it takes its time to reach the bottom display. Okay, again, immediate, and the bottom display shows a delay. We turn the button on again, the top one is immediate, and the bottom one has a 200 tick delay. Now my frame rate is roughly at around 20 FPS. So I guess that the actual delay takes something between 5 and 10 seconds, which seems to be accurate, right? Let's look at it again. Yeah, so that was roughly 5 seconds. So I guess that calculation roughly works out. Okay, now this is obviously an exaggerated example, just to make the principle clear. And you might be wondering, what does it matter? Why is that relevant? Because if you have let's say a shape analyzer or an unstacker, and you connect that to your MAM, then what gives if your wiring module takes maybe a few milliseconds or up to a second extra before it enables your machines? Why is that a problem? Well, as long as you're working with simple wiring modules, it's not a problem. And by simple wiring modules, as I said in the beginning, I mean one-way wiring modules. One-way wiring modules is where you have an input wire, an input signal, you process that signal, and then you get an output signal. And there may be, if this is a huge module, this output signal may take up to a second or a few seconds of delay before you get that signal. But there is no problem as long as you are not intending to reuse that signal to power the same module. And that's where the trouble comes in. So, as we know by now, the way this machine operates is by checking the candidates. You know, we have the 5-piece approach. We are going to get candidates and we're going to try and verify whether those candidates constitute the same, the eventual shape together. Whether if you combine those candidates, we can produce the shape that we'll eventually need. And if the answer is no, we need to check a new candidate. And now the problem arises. You know, we are going to cycle through our candidates and we have a verification module, a validation module at the end of our calculation module, our analysis module, which is going to check, like, are these candidates valid candidates? Can we use this combination of candidates to produce the final shape? And if not, we send a new group of candidates through the module and we check it again. And the question is, how long does it take before we know that our candidates are not worthwhile? Because our machines are outputting, they are processing the various units, and the output is going to flicker, it's going to stutter, you know, it's with light speed, it's going to start outputting new shapes. And the question is, when do we know that our machines are finished processing and we can consider the current output as the actual candidate that we're analyzing? In other words, we need a rough idea about how long the analyzing module takes. And that time we need to put on the validator module, we need to install a forceful delay on the analyzer module, so that when the analyzer module says this is a valid series of candidates, we know that we are done processing and we can restart the process with a new candidate. I hope you are still with me, because that process is incredibly confusing. You know, each module takes a tick, right? Each virtual processing unit takes a tick. Now, if you look at this module, you know, have fun counting all the ticks that are in this module, because all of these modules are connected, they are interdependent, they depend on one another. So how long does this module take before the validator over here says, like, okay, we are done checking this and we are going to try a new series of candidates right now? That is the big question that basically broke my brain, and I'm going to immediately come clean that this machine is not fine-tuned in that regard, okay? Because the concept of ticks, even though I understand it conceptually, the way it plays out in practice is still very obscure to me. I basically winged it for this machine. I'm going to be very honest about that. So in terms of ticks, right, this machine can definitely be optimized, and the reason or the fact that this machine is not optimized in terms of ticks is also the reason why, for example, I have created this anti-jank device. So sometimes I may get conflicts on my wiring, and meanwhile I have figured out that the reason must be because some modules are taking a slightly longer amount of ticks to process their whatever they're, you know, designated to do. And some other modules may already, you know, be carrying on with the next step in the analysis process without having received the proper... So the delay on those modules, they start working before they're supposed to. That's basically what it comes down to, right? And this is an extremely delicate process that, as I said, I must admit, is definitely not fine-tuned, right? It roughly works for most shapes, but there may be some instances where, you know, you might have a frame drop or something, and then that influences how my machine works or something, right? So the concept of ticks is very, very, very elaborate. It is very advanced for Shapes.io, and I want you to be aware of this. We are going to talk about the modules, and I will get back to how these ticks exactly work, because, as I said, each virtual processing unit adds one tick to the tally, and in the end, you are left with, you know, a few seconds. This is why every candidate attempt might take a few seconds to process, and you know, it might take the machine the analysis module a few seconds to confirm that we are done checking this particular candidate before we try the next one. And since we need to try a few candidates before we find the actual shape, potentially, it might take this machine up to a minute. In my experience, it takes up to a minute to run the analysis module right here. And then after that minute, when we get the output, it goes through the validator, we get our pieces, and then it runs into the assembly line, where the actual MAM might need a minute or so to get up to a full belt of output that then eventually feeds into the hub. So this video, we are already at the end of this video. This is very conceptual, this is very theoretical, and especially it is very abstract, because unlike with the physical modules, they are slow enough so that you can look what's going on, right? You can run some lines, some shapes, some colors into your modules, and you can see how fast they are, because they are slow enough for your human eye to capture it. The ticks, on the other hand, they are a lot faster than the human eye. So you have to understand what's going on, because you don't actually see it going on. It's too fast. And that makes that's what makes it so hard to build a TMAM, because you need the knowledge. You cannot, it is very, very hard. It is an extreme challenge to infer your knowledge of what is happening and why certain modules are providing certain outputs, whereas you are expecting others. It is super challenging to understand why at given points you may be getting conflicts on your wires where they are not intended. And all of that is because these ticks are so fast. And the ironic thing is that the better the equipment you're working with, I am working with a relatively slow computer. You can see this. My frame rates are at now they're at around 20. They just dropped to 6 or 10 a second ago, which in this case, in this context, is actually an advantage, because it means when you input a signal on a wire, it gives your brain some time, it gives your brain and your eyes some time to see the signal being carried on from one module to the next. But the thing is, you know, if you are looking at this module right here, and it is connected to this module up here, then it is impossible to... Come on now. Come on, don't give me 1 frame per second. Seriously? Do you see this in the bottom right corner? 1 frame per second? Yeah, I don't know what's going on here. But anyway, my point is that when you are zoomed in enough to these modules that you can actually see what you're doing and you're working on them, then if this signal somehow influences some module that you have on the other side of your entire setup, then you cannot catch up. You have to know by heart how your machine works. You have to know this entire structure by heart, only to be able to deduct why some module might be causing problems, right? So in that sense, as I said, I don't know the last dots on the I's nor the last crosses on the T's of my own machine. I have to admit that. And when we are done with this series, I am likely going to rework this machine and optimize it in terms of the ticks. And I might also get rid of the anti-jank device. In a later video, we're going to have a look at the actual anti-jank device, what it does. Just for fun, we're going to have a look at that. And meanwhile, I don't know what is going on because honestly, I have never had a 1 frame per second frame rate before. I don't know why that is. Truth to God. So, I think I'm going to wrap up the video here. If you start building your TMAMs, you need to be aware of this tick issue. And in later videos, we are going to revisit that. We are going to look at the ticks and we're going to be able to observe that these modules have delays exactly because they are dependent on each other. You know, it takes one module a few milliseconds of a delay to output, but then that output is fed into a next module, which takes another few milliseconds of delay. And all of these, all of these modules that are chained, added up together, they take a processing delay that actually becomes measurable in seconds, right? So milliseconds turn to seconds the bigger you make your modules. And having said that, you know, I know it was very theoretical, it was very abstract. I rambled on for quite some time and I didn't give you a lot of concrete examples, but I hope that this video where I spoke about the theory in combinations with the next videos where we will see that applied to practice, you know, will make the pieces click, right? If you know what I'm saying. So I'm going to wrap up the video here. I hope you found it interesting, even though it was very theoretical and not very practical or concrete. Hope you found it interesting. Hope you had fun watching. And I hope to see you again in part 8. Take care. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.